Welcome to our February meeting of the Kipling Society. We're joining you from a new London venue. We're at the Army and Navy Club at 36 in London's Pall Mall, which we hope will be our home for a long and productive future. Tonight, it is my honour and pleasure to welcome Professor Charlotte Boyce from the University of Portsmouth, who's tonight's speaker. Charlotte is an associate professor in Victorian literature and culture, and she's also the faculty director of postgraduate research for humanities and social sciences at Portsmouth, where she has taught since 2007. She's also an honoured respected member of the British Association of Victorian Studies. And what she'll be telling us tonight is a piece of research that was first aired in that venue in September to great acclaim. And she's an advisory board member of the journal Victoriographies. Charlotte's research centres on 19th century literature and culture, and she's got a particular focus in recent times on food, hunger, and the practices of consumption. Together with Joan Fitzpatrick, she was the co-author of A History of Food in Literature from the 14th century to the present. That was published in 2017 by Routledge. And it's a critical, comprehensive overview of food and related themes in literary and cultural texts from the medieval period to the 21st century. Charlotte has also published articles on topics including famine, fasting, taste, and spaces of consumption in journals such as Victorian Literature and Culture and Victorian Poetry and Neo-Victorian Studies. And Charlotte's currently writing a monograph on hunger and masculinity in 19th century culture. Tonight, she's going to speak to us about managing colonial famine in Kipling's Indian story, William the Conqueror. So, over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Alex, for that really glowing introduction and for inviting me to speak to you this evening. I've been saying to a couple of people, I feel a bit of an imposter here because I wouldn't characterize myself as a Kipling expert. But as Alex mentioned, I'm working on this new book project on hunger and masculinity in the 19th century. And Kipling's really one of the few writers to go into any detail in their fiction about famine in India during that period. So that's very much why I've sort of turned to Kipling as part of this project. I'm afraid my talk this evening, it's not a very cheery topic. Particularly for those of us in the UK, we're just before sort of dinner, to talk about colonial famine doesn't feel like the most cheerful topic, but hopefully it will be interesting. So yeah, this talk emerges out of a new book project that I'm working on called Hunger and Masculinity in 19th Century Culture. And the organising idea of this project is that hunger in both its physical and its metaphorical forms is central to constructions of masculinity in the 19th century. Did you say just tap? Okay, great. So in his 1859 work, The Physiology of Common Life, the philosopher George Henry Lewis characterized hunger as the very fire of life, underlying all impulses to labor and moving man to noble activities by its imperious demands. Look where we may, we see it as the motive power which sets the vast array of human machinery in action. And then he goes on to elaborate on this point. He claims that hunger is the kind of driving force behind industrial development and the sort of growth of civilization. He says it labours at the furnace and the plough and is the invisible overseer of the men who cut paths through mountains, throw bridges across rivers, and intersect the land with the great iron ways which bring city into daily communication with city. So there's this sense for Lewis that hunger sort of inspires acts of discovery, invention, and progress. But of course, there is a downside too. If hunger becomes too powerful, then it no longer works as this kind of beneficent spur to masculine activity, but rather it becomes something dangerous and debilitating. Lewis writes, when its progress is unchecked, it becomes a devouring flame, destroying all that is most noble in man. Hunger subjugates the humanity in man and makes the brute predominate. So there's a sense that there's this balancing act in Victorian culture, key to the successful performance of manliness in Victorian culture is the ability to withstand or perhaps master hunger, to channel its potentially destructive energy into productive forms of activity. And perhaps unsurprisingly, this ability is typically racialized in 19th century representation. Whereas white Western male bodies are frequently constructed in terms of kind of a stoical endurance and an ability to sort of withstand hunger. In the literature of the period, Black, brown, and Indigenous male bodies are associated, on the one hand, with violent or insurgent forms of hunger, so a kind of hunger that inspires rebellion or riot, conflict, or on the other hand, with a passive, fatalistic attitude to famishment. So there's a sense that, they can't save themselves, they need to be saved by someone else. This schema is sometimes complicated by intersecting ideologies of nation and class, but in general, I think it's fair to say that non-white masculinities are assumed to be less capable of managing bodily privation than their white counterparts in Victorian print culture. And this racialized dynamics comes sharply into focus in the short story that I want to examine in today's paper, Rudyard Kipling's William the Conqueror. A colonial romance set against the distinctly unromantic backdrop of a catastrophic famine in southern India, William the Conqueror was first published in parts in December 1895 and January 1896 in the British periodical The Gentlewoman and also the American Ladies' Home Journal, before being reprinted in the 1898 collection The Day's Work. And Alex assures me that everyone will be familiar with the story, so I'll give you just a very brief sort of refresher. The eponymous heroine of the story is William Martin, a tomboyish figure who rides horses, wears her hair cropped, speaks fluent Urdu, and tells us in a clear signal of the text's ideological investment in energized masculinity that she likes men who do things. When her police chief brother Jack Martin and his civil engineer friend Scott are seconded from the northern region of Punjab by the Madras government to the south to help with the famine relief effort there, William accompanies them in spite of her brother's objections. And in the course of the group's efforts to distribute food aid to the desperate local population, romance blossoms between William and Scott, whose practical, industrious character and commitment to public duty is idealized in the text. And the story ends by relocating this happy couple back to their northern base in time for the Christmas celebrations, the pieces of the Madras famine having been picked up and put neatly away by the British relief effort. So this closing image of containment at the end of the text aligns Kipling's story with the cultural framework that Upamanyu Pablo Mukherjee has labelled palliative imperialism. So that is the idea of imperialism as an act of care undertaken in order to fulfill Europe's historic mission of rescuing the native inhabitants of South Asia from their own habitat. Mukherjee explains that palliative imperialism allocates an essentially benign motive to the agents of global power and obscures and legitimizes those structural inequalities that produce the disaster events in the first place. So today I want to read William the Conqueror in relation to Mukherjee's theory and argue that the text's faith in the mollifying effects of imperial bureaucracy is actually ultimately a fractured and uncertain one, troubled by the sort of real history of British famine relief in 19th century India on the one hand, and by the spectre of future sustainability crises on the other. So before turning to Kipling's text, though, I want to start off with a bit of historical context. As Parama Roy has argued, famine has long been metonymically chained to conceptions of South Asia in the British popular imagination. And she argues famine was one of the notorious features of colonial rule in India, resulting in tens of millions of deaths just in the final third of the 19th century alone. And as you can see there from the dates on the screen, in the year of Kipling's birth, actually a terrible famine was unfolding in the east of India, in the province of Orissa, now the state of Odisha, and also in neighbouring Bengal. Of course, the Kiplings were in Bombay, so the opposite side of the country, but and Rudyard Kipling was a babe in arms at this time, but I think his parents must have been familiar with what was going on because it was reported very much in the press. So they, even though they might have not seen firsthand the unfolding of the famine, they would have been familiar with it. Rudyard Kipling had left India by the time of the most deadly famine, the Madras famine, or the Great Famine, as it's sometimes known, because it actually extended right across the south of the country in 1876 to 78. And this event actually prompted a commission, the British, to set up a commission to look into a sort of the handling of famine in India, and subsequently to set up famine codes and a famine insurance fund in the 1880s in an attempt to avert further disasters. The effects of these remedial measures were fairly limited, though, and they failed to prevent the occurrence of another devastating famine in 1896. So literally just after William the Conqueror first appeared in print. And again, Kipling wasn't actually living in India at this point. He was living in the US. But I find the timing of this famine fiction quite uncanny. It feels sort of eerily prescient. Its appearance on the eve of this new famine maybe points to the fact that the measures introduced in the 1880s had by no means consigned sort of sustainability crises to the past. In the raft of official governmental reports that typically emerged in the wake of this series of disasters, the prevalence of famine in India was insistently naturalized and normalized as a kind of inherent part of the South Asian climate and terrain. In a dispatch relating to the 1867 Bengal and Orissa famine, the then Secretary of State for India, Stafford Northcote, noted fatalistically, "I do not forget that in a tropical country, depending on the annual rains for its main supply of water, dearths and even famines must occasionally occur," adding, "It is but little that the most powerful government can effect when the land is visited by these evils to avert the most appalling forms of death." The authors of the 1880 report of the Indian Famine Commission set up in the wake of the Great Madras Famine similarly identified drought as the direct cause of all the devastating famines experienced in the subcontinent. And Charles Blair, an engineer in the Indian Public Works Department, predicted in 1874 that famines will recur in India forever unless some vast climatological change occurs. And in the British press, too, nature and climate were invariably blamed for the high incidence of famine on the subcontinent, although the unpreparedness of the colonial administration also came in for some censure. An 1866 article in the Illustrated London News noted that at intervals ranging from 6 to 10 years, an agonizing wail reaches us from India, the simultaneous cry of myriads perishing of hunger. For the most part, it should be listened to as nature's stern protest against the negligence of man. Occasional droughts of long duration seem to be a feature of the meteorological system of that peninsula, where, however, the soil is well nigh as capable of irrigation as Egypt, and under provident administration might produce with unfailing regularity more than sufficient for all the wants of the teeming population. And maladministration was also highlighted as an aggravating factor in an 1867 article in Fraser's magazine, which criticised the red tapeism of the Indian system. comparing it to the dysfunctional circumlocution office in Charles Dickens's novel Little Dorrit. Yet, despite this acknowledgement of human mismanagement, the article in Fraser's ultimately reverts to this kind of fatalistic view of famine as naturally endemic to India, in its conclusion that these Indian famines cannot be otherwise than terrible. No human prudence can ever prevent their occurrence. And concerns about climate and food supply frequently intersected with apprehensions about unsustainable population growth in British famine discourse. In 1880, Sir Richard Temple, who had served as famine commissioner during the Madras famine and is generally acknowledged to have done not a great job, wrote that the population of India exceeds the population of any country in the world except China. Hence, anxiety is often felt lest the resources of India should someday prove unequal to so heavy a pressure and so severe a strain, lest the people should grow too thickly on the cultivable land, and the supply of food for this population should fall short on some dire occasion. And he goes on to conclude in a more sort of Gothic vein that even in prosperity then, famine is like an apparition warning people of doom, and as a skeleton pointing its finger to apprise the nation of a danger which is ever impending and cannot be warded off. And this kind of apocalyptic turn in Temple's language reminds me very much of the words of the 18th century demographer Thomas Malthus, his famous characterization of famine as the last, the most dreadful resource of nature, a gigantic, inevitable stalking presence that with one mighty blow can level the population with the food of the world. According to Malthusian doctrine, famine is a sort of natural and necessary check on exponential population growth, and any attempt to interfere with its operation is doomed to failure. In a controversial passage from the second edition of his essay on the principle of population, which imagines the global food supply as a kind of private dinner party, Malthus argues, a man has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food. At nature's mighty feast, there is no vacant cover for him. She tells him to be gone and will quickly execute her own orders if he do not work upon the compassion of some of her guests. If these guests get up and make room for him, other intruders immediately appear demanding the same favour. The report of a provision for all that come fills the hall with numerous claimants. The order and harmony of the feast is disturbed. The plenty that before reigned is changed into scarcity. The guests learn too late their error in counteracting those strict orders to all intruders issued by the great mistress of the feast, who, wishing that all her guests should have plenty and knowing that she could not provide for unlimited numbers, humanely refused to admit fresh comers when her table was already full. Now, more recent theorists of famine have challenged this understanding of famine as a simple matter of demand for food outstripping supply, pointing instead to issues of access and entitlement. And in Amartya Sen's well-known formulation, starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It's not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat. In the late 19th century, though, Malthusian principles, together with a commitment to laissez-faire economics, continued to hold sway among colonial administrators, who balked at the idea of welfarist interference with what they saw as inexorable natural laws. And thus, in 1880, the Indian Famine Commissioners stressed that direct government intervention in food supply markets should be avoided unless absolutely necessary, and cautioned that famine relief measures should avoid every tendency to relax in the people the sense of the obligation which rests on them to provide for their own support by their own labour. Now, Kipling's William the Conqueror takes a very different view, I think. There's a more urgent sense of Britain's ethical responsibility to provide for those stricken by famine in the text. So the narrative opens with this news that an emergency has just been announced in the Madras presidency, with 8 districts being placed under the operation of the Famine Code. And in case people are unfamiliar with them, famine codes were metrics of food insecurity, developed, as I say, in the 1880s to help provincial administrations assess the severity of the scarcity in their localities and then manage the implementation of relief programs. While the critic Mike Davis has questioned the efficacy of these codes in reality, in Kipling's fictionalized version of a famine in India, they're the impetus for immediate mitigative activity. We learn that swift, practical measures have already been put in train by the time that news of the famine reaches the text's male protagonists, Martin and Scott. Jimmy Hawkins, a man who's previously been knighted for his services to the Indian government and who's praised as having more bundabust or organisational ability than most, has been put in charge of the relief effort and has immediately set about requisitioning every man who isn't doing two men's work to support the urgent humanitarian activity that's required. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the ability to successfully manage a pucker famine is unambiguously racialised in Kipling's narrative. As the telegram from Hawkins summoning Scott to the south bluntly puts it, famine was sore in the land and white men were needed. And like all good Kipling heroes, Martin and Scott are energised by the news of the disaster, as Mukherjee notes. They have not only the physical strength and managerial competence, but also the effective capacities and emotional energies to undertake the palliative work of empire, even when that labour comes at great personal risk to themselves. As Scott ominously predicts, we shall have cholera as sure as a gun when the rains break. And later in the text, he does actually fall ill with a fever following his sort of Herculean contribution to the famine relief effort. Despite their much vaunted energy, the scale of the challenge that meets Martin and Scott on their arrival in Madras very much threatens to overwhelm even these most capable of men. The South is represented as a foreign land, more strange to them than to the untravelled Englishman. It's a land of death, lit by roaring lines of thick, fat fires where they were burning the dead. Within this furiously hot environment, the living are persistently dehumanized as a swarming mass or horde who cluster around the grain trucks like ants by spilled honey, or creep into the relief camps to lay down their phantoms of children before staggering away to die. In the midst of these cataclysmic, almost atavistic scenes of hunger, pestilence, and death, Kipling's heroic imperialists function as harbingers of modernity. Notably, they arrive as part of a long convoy of heavily laden grain trains, importing food from the plenteous north, where we're told they have more crops than they know what to do with. By representing the railways as a novel technological solution to the age-old problem of famine, Kipling's narrative chimes with the institutional view of British officials that the growth of these means of communication would serve as safeguards against future famine, providing for the supply of food across India in times of scarcity. In reality, though, as Mike Davis has pointed out, new technologies could have the opposite effect, accelerating rather than relieving food shortages. The newly constructed railroads were used by some merchants to ship grain inventories away from outlying drought-stricken districts to central depots for hoarding, as well as for protection from rioters. And similarly, the telegraph system that in William the Conqueror mobilises the relief effort, in actuality ensured that price hikes could be coordinated in 1,000 towns at once, placing staple foods beyond the means of the multitude to pay. In Kipling's story, though, it's the intransigence of the local population, rather than grain speculation and profiteering, that risks undermining the government's humanitarian efforts. When Scott travels around the parched countryside with carts loaded with wheat, millet and barley, good food grains needing only a little grinding, he's astonished to find that the starving people reject the life-giving stuffs that he brings to them. The narrator explains that they were rice eaters. They could hull rice in their mortars, but they knew nothing of the heavy stone querns of the north, and less of the material that the white man convoyed so laboriously. They clamoured for rice, unhusked paddy, such as they were accustomed to, and when they found that there was none, broke away weeping from the sides of the cart. What was the use of these strange, hard grains that choked their throats? They would die. And then and there, very many of them kept their word. Others took their allowance and bartered enough millet to feed a man through a week for a few handfuls of rotten rice saved by some less unfortunate. A few put their share into the rice mortars, pounded it, and made a paste with foul water, but they were very few. Scott understood dimly that many people in the India of the South ate rice as a rule, but he had spent his service in a grain province, had seldom seen rice in the blade or ear, and least of all would have believed that in a time of deadly need, men could die at arm's length of plenty sooner than touch food they did not know. In vain the interpreters interpreted, in vain his two policemen showed in vigorous pantomime what should be done. The starving crept away to their bark and weeds, grubs, leaves, and clay, and left the open sacks untouched. Now, this passage is really interesting to me, and that's the reason I've kind of quoted it at length, because although on the one hand it betrays a typically imperialistic frustration with what's perceived as the obduracy of the subject population, it also, perhaps unintentionally, accords to the people of Madras a sense of dietary agency, challenging perceptions of Indian homogeneity, while also undercutting the commonplace assumption that any food is palatable to the starving. And the British, incidentally, had prior experience of this when dealing with the Irish famine in the 1840s. Peel, in the early days of the famine, imported Indian corn, as it was known, or maize, from the United States to try and support the starving population in Ireland. But the Irish people didn't have the sort of resources or the know-how how to prepare this food, and they called it Peel's brimstone because it was so kind of hard and unpalatable. So I think this scene then, with the sort of conflict between the dietary wants of the population and what the relief effort is supplying, reveals the limitations of the kind of white saviour complex that's so central to the project of palliative imperialism. The well-meaning Scot is parachuted into a community where he knows next to nothing about the local foodways, the food preparation techniques, or culinary utensils available to the people. And this lack of regional knowledge fatally compromises his ability to deliver effective humanitarian aid. This fascinating but brief rupture in the text's overall ideological commitment to imperial values is quickly papered over, however, as British ingenuity is once again posited as the solution to the problem of Indian hunger. William, who's determined to help the relief effort as much as she can, borrows 50 rupees from Scott in order to purchase a supply of condensed milk, a commercial product that implicitly signifies modernity in the text. And she proceeds to feed it in diluted form to the abandoned babies in her care. Scott, meanwhile, comes up with an even more ingenious and kind of cost-effective way of feeding the foundling children of the famine camps. He instructs his men to round up all of the stray goats they can find and fatten them on the grains that the people have rejected. And the goat's milk is then used to nourish the starving infants under his jurisdiction. So in this way, Scott manages to circumvent the local people's resistance to unfamiliar foodstuffs and to save lives. The narrator tells us that when the women saw that their children did not die, they made shift to eat a little of the strange foods and crawled after the carts, blessing the master of the goats. Now, while Scott is always a little self-conscious of how absurd he must look in his new role of sort of milkmaid stroke nursemaid, Kipling's text deploys the language of Greek mythology to shore up and emphasize his heroic manliness, to kind of reassure us that he's still this manly hero. We're told that as he enters the famine camp, the sunset catches him and bathes him in a brilliant light, making him appear to William as beautiful as Paris, a god in a halo of golden dust. And William Ladd Taylor's illustration of the scene in the Ladies' Home Journal, later reproduced in the day's work, amplifies this sense of deification, I think, casting Scott in an almost Christ-like pose here, walking slowly at the head of his flocks, as the accompanying caption puts it. The recurrent motif of British colonisers nursing Indian children with milk is clearly intended to position empire as a benevolent mother figure, selflessly sustaining her dependents. However, these maternal metaphorics in fact represent an insidious, help me, Alex, insidious rewriting of imperial history. Brilliant, thank you. The British administration mostly resisted calls to intervene in the Indian grain trade to ensure that areas of scarcity were supplied with affordable food. Defending his inaction in the case of the 1865 to 67 famine, the Lieutenant Governor of Bengal, Sir Cecil Beedon, argued that such government activity might have aggravated the calamity by interfering in private trade. As Viscount Cranborne put it in an excoriating speech to Parliament in 1867, the doctrines of political economy were worshipped as a sort of fetish by officials who, because they believed in the long run supply and demand would square themselves, seemed to have utterly forgotten that human life was short and that men could not subsist without food beyond a few days. So great was the government's commitment to a policy of non-interference that at the height of the Madras famine in 1877, Indian wheat exports to Britain actually increased. As Mike Davis notes, at a time of devastating crisis, Londoners were in effect eating India's bread. In William the Conqueror, this laissez-faire economic reality is erased by the fantasy of paternalist intervention. As well as being provided by the grain trains from the north, Madras is eventually supplied by a rice ship from Burma, which brings sufficient paddy to the 8 districts to hold the people safe until the monsoon rains arrive. While working like demons to address the emergency in the present, Kipling's colonialists also invest in a range of preventative measures and acts of forward planning to reduce the risk of further calamity. Scott, who you remember is an irrigation engineer by profession, identifies a broken down old reservoir during his travels around the dusty countryside that might provide a useful future water supply. And he draws up plans for its restoration, and these are quickly implemented. And then, when the rains finally come, the government distributes seed grain and cash advances to the Indian people to help accelerate their return to a state of self-sufficiency. And interestingly, the measures that Kipling's talking about here, these are the things that the Indian people were asking for when they were sort of petitioning officials, writing to newspapers. These practical constructive actions stand in such sharp contrast to the British administration's actual famine response during the latter half of the 19th century that it's tempting to read their inclusion in William the Conqueror as a tacit rebuke to the established policy of non-interference. And again, it's a little reference here that's very telling for me. The reference to the rice ship from Burma is particularly interesting in this respect, because on the one occasion where the British actually managed to very significantly minimise loss of life during the Bihar famine of 1873 to 74, it was because of the early importation and swift distribution of rice from that country. So an apparently inconsequential mention of Burma then takes on a rather more charged quality when read in the light of the history of British famine relief. So I think there are these little moments of critique in William the Conqueror. And we can see this again, I think, in the text's representation of kind of officialdom and the machinery of empire. In common with the article from Fraser's magazine that I quoted earlier, William the Conqueror seems to be a text frustrated by the red tapeism of imperial bureaucracy. Significantly, Scott's efforts to palliate the effects of famine are successful in large part because Jimmy Hawkins, the head of famine, gives him a sort of free rein to implement the measures he thinks necessary. And the text seems to validate this sort of maverick quality when it comes to crisis management. We're told that Scott has greater operational freedom than Hawkins because the government held the head of famine tied neatly to a telegraph wire. And if Jimmy had ever regarded telegrams seriously, the death rate of that famine would have been much higher than it was. So there's a kind of healthy disdain here for the sort of directives that were regularly issued to lieutenant governors and district collectors, instructing them to be mindful of the economic burdens of famine relief and placing restrictions on the action they could take. Yet, despite this awareness of the indifference and sometimes ineptitude of the colonial administrative machine in the face of mass death, I think there are, though, important limitations to Kipling's critique of British famine policy in William the Conqueror. The text's investment in benevolent paternalism seems to derive more from an abstract sense of duty than from any real compassion or empathetic recognition of the Indian people as fellow human beings with an equal life to write. And as I noted earlier, the text tends to dehumanize the subject population. At one point, Scott and Martin are unable to distinguish between the living bodies of foodless folk and corpses. And later on, the narrative refers with a kind of casual contempt to the famine camp's dependents as so many scores of loathsome black children waiting to be fed. So the native population is mainly represented as sort of passive victims. There's certainly no acknowledgement of the repeated steps taken by Indian people themselves to prevent or prepare for impending disaster, or to alleviate the sufferings of the most vulnerable when disaster arrived. The story closes with confirmation that the famine is all over except the shouting, and that owing to the unstinting toil of stoical, energetic men such as Scott, the death rate has not been too heavy, things considered. We're reassured that men picked up the pieces and put them neatly away of the famine in the 8 districts. And yet this confidence in the ability of white imperial masculinity to manage away the threat of Indian famine is troubled, I think, by an anxious reference to the overpopulated Hindu South that William and Scott are leaving behind them at the end of the tale. The unspoken implication here, I think, is that India represents, to quote Mukherjee, a zone of permanent disaster, and food scarcity crises will continue to haunt the unsustainably populated subcontinent, despite the best managerial efforts of the British. What's missing from this tacit acknowledgement of the limitations of palliative imperialism is, of course, any recognition of the structural role of imperial politics in transforming drought into famine in the first place. This role was recognised and ably interrogated, however, by a growing number of indigenous voices in the late 19th century. As the Indian nationalist, Dadabhai Naoroji would write just 6 years after William the Conqueror first appeared in print. How strange it is that the British rulers do not see that, after all, they themselves are the main cause of the destruction that ensues from droughts. It is the pitiless eating of India's substance, the sad bleeding to which India is subjected, that is destroying India. Why blame poor nature when the fault lies at your own door? And that's where I'll finish. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Charlotte. We have time now for some questions. Please raise your hand here in the room or there on Zoom if you have any questions you'd like to ask Charlotte. Yes, Mr. Howell, please go ahead.
Yes, I was just wondering what inspired Kipling to write that story at the time he did, because it was apparently published in 1898.